Konami's Castlevania is one of the most storied franchises in gaming that spans 3 decades, where it features a common narrative of the Belmont family, a clan of vampire hunters, and their quest to defeat Dracula. Known for its platform gameplay that would become evolved over the years, Castlevania has become one of Konami's most beloved franchises. Castlevania made its debut in 1986 on the NES, where you play as Simon Belmont to take on Medusa, the Grim Reaper, and Frankenstein before finally being able to challenge the final boss, Dracula. Castlevania II Simon's Quest from 1987 featured a brave new day and night cycle, where during the day, the city would be full of people going about their normal business, but at night, the people were replaced by monster after monster, never giving the player a break until dawn arrived. The franchise saw its first handheld release on Game Boy in 1989 with Castlevania The Adventure. Set a century before the events of the first Castlevania, you play as Christopher Belmont, an ancestor of Simon and the Belmont family of later games. Castlevania's first release for the Super Nintendo was Super Castlevania IV in 1991, a reboot of the original Castlevania on the NES. In this reboot, Konami added an awesome new feature to the game, which was Simon Belmont's updated whip, which could attack enemies in 8 directions, and the player could also spin the whip to block projectiles. 1994 saw a shift in the Castlevania franchise. For the very first time, you would not be playing as a member of the beloved Belmont family. Instead, you would play as John Morris or Eric Lecarde in Castlevania BLOODLINES on the Sega Genesis. Perhaps the greatest of the classic Castlevania titles was 1997's release of Castlevania Symphony of the Night on the Sony PlayStation. Playing as Dracula's son, Alucard, Konami stepped away from the level-by-level design used in the past. Symphony of the Night instead introduced players to an even more open-ended feeling and had the most RPG elements of any of the Castlevania games before it. Symphony of the Night also had one of the most memorable endings. If you refused to defeat the initial final boss, Richter Belmont, suddenly a whole new character would appear, tell you that you were in the wrong castle the entire time, and introduce you to an upside-down version of it. From there, you'd have to play through it all over again to finally find and defeat Dracula. Following Symphony of the Night came of the first Castlevania game to transition into the 3D world with Castlevania for the Nintendo 64. Despite fair reviews at its time of release, the loyal Castlevania fanbase had some mixed opinions with the direction that the storied franchise had now taken. Meanwhile, releases for handhelds would come to serve the Castlevania hardcore scene, as they offered some of the best stories and boss fights the franchise had ever seen. Aria of Sorrow's Soma vs. Julius battle was phenomenally good, which then led into Dawn of Sorrow and puts Soma in battle with resisting the temptation of becoming the next Dracula. If he fails, this unlocks Julius mode, where you start to play as Julius Belmont for the remainder of the game, and now must defeat the newly reincarnated Dracula. Portrait of Ruin and Order of Ecclesia then followed, and Castlevania for handhelds were must-haves for anyone remotely interested in side-scrollers in general. In 2010, Castlevania saw a reboot to the series with Castlevania Lords of Shadow. Originally, the game was not intended to be a Castlevania title, but a brand new IP for Konami. However, they determined during the development of Lords of Shadow that it'd make for a great addition to the franchise by bringing new gameplay elements and a fresh storyline. Which brings us to Konami's highly anticipated next release to the series, Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2. This will be the 35th installment in the storied Castlevania franchise and one of the most anticipated releases so far. The story picks up right where the predecessor ended, as Gabriel Belmont is now known as Dracula. With that being said, enemies will now behave differently as they are equipped with armored shields, which in turn will require more skill and tactical thinking to defeat them effectively. The Mercury Steam development team working on Lords of Shadow 2 also wanted the game to flow more freely by removing load times for a more cohesive experience than ever before. Players will now be able to look and move however they desire with a new free-moving camera, and allows them to view the world in more ways. Lords of Shadow 2 will take place in Dracula's castle, as well as a new modern city to the game, both of which are open to the player to explore. The game also boasts a new engine that will be sure to enhance the improved gameplay mechanics that Mercury Steam has been working on. Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2 is scheduled for a February 25th release in North America and a February 28th release in Europe.